Hello, everyone. My name is Ole Kagan. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator with LA County Library, and I welcome you to Work Ready, What's New in Workplace Communication. And now I'd like to tell you about the Work Ready program. Work Ready started in December of 2020 with the purpose of helping folks get a job, improve their work situation, and plan a more sustainable career path. And we're doing that in two ways. One is we lend out Wi-Fi hotspots and laptops for 6-week loans out of 27 library locations, breaking down one barrier to applying for a job and getting online training. And two is we provide virtual events just like this one on a range of work-related topics from the basics like cover letters, resumes, interviews, to deep dives into careers and all kinds of other career-related topics. And you can see over 50 of those past classes at any time by checking out our work and career playlist on our YouTube channel, which I'm going to post in the chat right now. And this program as well will be posted to our YouTube channel later on this week. So if you miss anything during this presentation, do not despair. You will be able to watch it again. And I will send you a link to that video via email follow-up. So if you signed up using the email that you have access to, then you will definitely receive that follow-up email. The Work Ready program is made possible due to funds provided by the American Rescue Plan. And I also want to let you know about next week's program. We have a program called Work Ready Smashing Through Networking Barriers. A lot of people find networking challenging, and there are various reasons for that. And our speaker next week, Celia Gutierrez, will tell you about some of those barriers and give you practical tips on how to overcome them. Sign up for that now. Don't miss that program. That's going to be on Tuesday, December 12th at 11 a.m., a week from right now. So I just posted the registration link for that in the chat. Of course, that's absolutely free, as are all of our library events. And if you're interested in learning more about library events, you can go to lacountylibrary.org. On the top right-hand side, click the events button, and you'll get all the events, in person and virtual. Teens, kids, adults, older adults, out of 85 library locations. You can check those out. If you're only interested in virtual events, you can limit to that. You can do that by hovering over that events button, and you'll get a drop down that says virtual programming. Click on that, and you'll only see Zoom events like this one, also for all ages, and of course, also, as with everything at the library, absolutely free. Okay, let's get on to today's presentation. What's new in workplace communication? I will be your presenter for today. Once again, my name is Ole Kagan. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator with LA County Library. I welcome you. It's an exciting topic that we're covering today. What's new in workplace communication? I would say that most people have an intuitive feeling about what's new in workplace communication. And I think I'm going to be covering probably what most people are thinking about when we talk about new stuff in workplace communication. But if I don't cover what you're interested in, then by all means, let me know in the chat, ask in the Q&A, and I will give you my feedback on that new element. But we're going to be covering a lot today. Here is our agenda for the day. We're going to be doing an introduction. I'm going to do some defining and categorizing of various communication techniques, communication methods, to give you a way to kind of break down what you're seeing out there. I'll talk about level of formality, something very important when it comes to workplace communication, something that isn't just a new trend, but something that's been changing over many years, decades even. We'll talk about remote and hybrid meetings give you some tips for those, and I'll end by talking about working in the cloud, which is what so many people who are working remotely are currently doing. We had a question in the chat about getting PDF of the slides of this presentation, and you will 100% get that. I will include that in the follow-up email so you can review the slides. And if you have questions for me, feel free to respond to that email. I'm happy to receive your emails with feedback, with questions. All is much appreciated. So our purpose for the presentation, the description of the event, is ever-changing technology makes keeping up with workplace communication challenging. Come learn best practices and tips for building connections and corralling success in a digital workplace. And who is presenting this? It is me. I have been working both in more traditional environment and remotely for the last 13 years with the LA County Library and several other places before that. I worked on the ground as a librarian at various locations. And so, very traditional. I worked at the reference desk, people to people. Then I became a community engagement coordinator, which is my current position, but I still worked in the office. That said, even before the pandemic, my staff was based all over the county. So in a way, we were straddling that barrier of our primary communication being digital, but also occasionally in person. So we already had hybrid communication. And then now, post-pandemic, we've all switched, at least in the county, to using Microsoft Teams and really have adopted a lot of what the pandemic has sort of wrought upon us and has pushed us to do. And so we all use these digital means for chat as well as doing in-person meetings. And so it's a very interesting time. And I want to share some of what I've learned and what I've noticed out in the field, both within the library and just out there through my reading and research. But let me ask you a question. I don't know if this is the right question to ask with a presentation like this, because this is what I'm going to be talking to you about, what's new in workplace communication. But I want to ask you out there, if you were presenting on this topic, what would you talk about? What kind of changes have you noticed in workplace communication? And possibly, what would you like me to cover today? Do you have any questions already, things you have come in here wondering about? I'm going to open up my chat so I can see any responses and give you a moment to type in what you might be interested in. I'm going to give you a second to type, and then I will move on with the presentation. So we've had a response: file sharing, Slack, instant messaging. Yes, 100%. Actually, all of those things are in one way or another in my presentation. I'm not going to give you a demonstration of Slack because I don't have it on my computer, but I will certainly be talking about how Slack works. Oh, this is a good one. The emergence of generational slang in workplace communication and the appropriateness of it. Yes, this is very important. As a millennial, I sort of straddle two different, very contrasting modes of communication. And so I'm right there with that. As somebody hasn't moved from Germany and isn't aware of so many changes in the US in terms of communication, etiquette. Yeah, etiquette is probably the main thing when it comes to workplace communication. We had a respondent says that they often write too much, and people prefer short, concise emails. And that's sometimes true. It really depends on what you're communicating about. We can get into that a little bit more later. Ooh, The proliferation of apps. I'm sick of them. They take too much time to monitor. Yeah, when you have especially instant messaging apps, yeah, when you have them on all day, they ping you when you're trying to do deep work, and that is one of the big changes with workplace communication. All right, well, in that vein, this person sort of preceded what I was going to say, and that's great. So the thing is that when we talk about trends in workplace communication, it's not just things that have changed since the pandemic. Over the past 30, 40, 50 years, depending on your field. And the reality is that workplace communication has changed a lot in certain fields, but not in others. There are many companies that remain relatively conservative in their communication. And then there are some tech companies, media companies that are way ahead of everybody else. And they sort of eventually bring people along. But we've got things in the workplace like video resumes that, where there are articles about them, but in reality, most companies don't require something like a video resume. And it's the same thing with workplace communication. There are many modes of workplace communication that exist within a relatively small amount of companies that have a large voice online, but not as important for most companies. But in the last 30 or 40, 50 years, the manner by which we communicate in the workplace has undergone several major shifts. And we can underscore this with the point that many people coming into the workplace today, starting their work life, have no idea what, say, triplicate forms or cubby holes where you checked for interoffice mail, or let's say fax are. These are things that don't occur as much today. Just like there may be some people here who are less familiar with, say, video chat, Teams channels, or Slack, and things that have risen over the last decade or two. The following cartoon highlights the traffic jam of mediums in today's workplace. This is a Dilbert cartoon. The pointy-haired boss says, "Alice, I just sent you an email." Then he hands her a piece of paper. "Here's a copy of my message, but I'll just tell you what it says. It says, I sent you a voicemail telling you to look for a fax that says, I want to talk to you." This is a feeling that many people have about the variety of forms of communication out there. And today I hope to entangle some of those for you and make it a little bit easier to, at the very least, answer the question, which of those should I use to talk to X person today? The fact, though, is that communication in its essence hasn't changed a whole lot. Despite all the seeming bells and whistles of newfangled communication mediums, the basics remain the same. There's a person who sends a message, there's the message, there's the recipient of the message, and there's the channel by which you send the message. Many of what we're going to be talking about today is really about that channel. And so let's talk in the beginning about some ways to look at those channels and to look at modes of communication. Despite the simplicity of what's on this slide, it's really the backbone of what I'm going to be covering throughout the rest of this presentation. I could do 100 demos for you, but what they do is they break down into these categories, which are not necessarily the be-all, end-all of categories, but I think that they make sense when it comes to thinking about how we communicate in the workplace and to really be able to glom on to the changes and what's new and what's coming. So the categories of communication are synchronous versus asynchronous. Synchronous means in sync. It means we're talking in the moment, live, right now. Whereas asynchronous is talking at different times. So if I send you an email message, you're going to receive that email message later. You might see it later, and then you're going to respond. I'm going to see it later. So the times are not in sync. The timeliness of communication. There's some communication that, number one, takes time to arrive, like if you send somebody a letter in the mail or a fax, it takes moments to arrive, but still a little bit of time. But really what I'm talking about here is the timeliness of the message, whether it will remain, whether it's like a periodical, somewhat disposable. So there's some messages, like text messages, that tend to go pretty quickly, like chat, instant messages or chat that go pretty quickly, and they're not going to be something that you're going to rely on later. Whereas if you get a letter about your performance at a job, that's going to go into your personal record or your personnel record. That's going to, or your permanent record. It's going to stay there. If you get, some kind of award, that's something that you're going to hold on to. Some communication, some documents you're going to be using over and over again and referring to. So the formality of the communication, and which is what I'm going to be talking about in the future, and something that's very important, is sometimes dependent on the timeliness of the communication, how soon will you need it, whether you'll need it in the future. Is communication written or spoken? Talking on the phone? Are we texting? Are we chatting? Do video chat? And that brings us to visual. We used to talk on the phone all the time, didn't see each other. Now we are using video chat a lot more often. And so now, in addition to voice, we also see each other, and I can make all kinds of wild hand gestures as I do. And that can help in communication because you've got body language. We also use emojis and GIFs to communicate our emotions and how we feel. That speaks again to the informality of some workplaces. And then, of course, like I said, there's nonverbal communication, body language, gestures, facial expressions, and all of the other means we communicate besides by what we actually say. Speaking of nonverbal communication, there is this nugget that has been going around for time, seemingly time immemorial. It's right up there with we only use 10% of our brain. And that is that 93% of communication is nonverbal. And just like the idea that we use 10% of our brain, we do not, 93% of communication is not nonverbal, is not true, not accurate. This is Dr. Mehrabian did 2 studies about that, and the studies focused on what people liked in what somebody else was communicating to them, and they said that 93%, or let's say 55% of what they liked in the message was body language, 38% was tone, and 7% were the words spoken. In fact, of course, we take in all of that to break it down to 7% of communication is words spoken, is not accurate and not very useful. I think the takeaway from that study is that body language, tone of voice, and other conditions of what we're wearing, etc., do have an effect on how the actual words and the meaning of our words are taken. But I feel like it does not require science to tell us that. That's something that is fairly intuitive when it comes to human communication. But it's not bad to have a reminder. So let's now move on to what's new in workplace communication. Obviously, the biggest change from the pandemic onward has been moving to a more remote work environment. But that's not all. There have been longer changes, and some of them have just been accelerated by the pandemic. Of course, when it comes to remote work, geography is no longer the limiting factor since we rely on technology to bridge the gap. So it makes sense that you just see there in the first graphic, the graphic on the left side, that 49% of people are video conferencing more, 40% are emailing more. Obviously we're communicating more using digital media just because more people are working remotely and not there in the office to talk to each other. But it's more than that. A lot of people feel like they're able to share less because of the distance in both their physical location, but also because of the way that the technology that mediates our communication is keeping us apart. So workplace communication that's more casual has become essential to creating the rapport that we used to build around the water cooler. Those little times where you chat about something personal, what happened over the weekend, things that aren't necessarily work related, that make you feel closer to your coworkers, is all the more important now that we're emailing, that we're using video conference and texting more. Some people are experiencing challenges with body language because, we're sitting in these boxes and it may not be as clear, what my whole demeanor is. You only see what my hands are doing. You only see my shoulders. You only see my face. And that's a lot, but it's not everything. Now, there's an interesting situation that occurred with one of my colleagues. They were interviewing somebody. So, already a somewhat tense situation for at least one of the people. It was a job interview, and they were sort of like this, taking notes. So they had their head down while the person was talking. And they later received feedback. Somebody had thought that they had fallen asleep during the interview because when they put their head down like this, it seemed like they were asleep, but in fact, they were taking notes. So these kind of miscommunications can occur because of the narrowness of the window through which people see us. And so it's all the more important to think about how we come across in the little box, our lighting, our gestures. Just like with public speaking, where we adjust our gestures based on the size of the audience, we adjust our voice and our intonations based on the size of the audience and the situation of the audience. We also have to do that all the more now when it comes to video chat. And many people have said that difficult conversations are now harder because they have a virtual component to them. Whereas when we worked in the office, we could just ask somebody to come into the office and, sit down. Now, those conversations have a prelude, and you have to schedule a meeting. You have to do this, you have to do that. You have to communicate in a way that's forthright and sensitive, but do it in a way that's mediated by whatever tool we're using. Those tools are often Zoom calls. We're talking about something serious, having difficult conversations with people, and yet so much about Zoom calls over the pandemic has included these amusing memes about people's challenges with Zoom calls. People have brought humor into the workplace through Zoom mishaps. The graphic over on the side here has the little cat in the corner. Each of these graphics is an example of things that have happened on Zoom calls that have sort of gone public. The cat in the corner is a lawyer who was, I think he was at a deposition, and he had a Zoom filter on that transformed him into a cat. He said, "I'm not a cat." And then, of course, the breakdown between boundaries of work and home have become so common. I know I've had my kids interrupt work meetings. Thankfully, our workplace is more or less informal, so it hasn't really had a strong effect on my work performance. But it's happened. And it happens where, things in your work environment regularly in video meetings on Zoom calls, somebody says, oh, somebody's doing construction outside of my house. I hope that the noise doesn't bother you. But the reality is some of the things within our home are not within our control. And that affects how we do the meetings, how we work, both when it comes to communication and just how we work when it comes to our quiet work. And it also affects the level of formality with which we communicate with each other. If we've got pets or kids or whatever around, or construction work happening, we sometimes have to say, oh, excuse me, I've got these things I can't control. And if you have toddlers, then you definitely can't control them. Well, let me ask you a question. How many of you had your first video call or online webinar during the pandemic? And then the secondary question, is it part of your regular life now? And the audience for work-ready programs are job seekers, people who are interested in improving your career path, planning a more sustainable career path. I'm getting yes. Everybody's saying yes. Had their first video call or online webinar during the pandemic, and is it part of your regular life now? We've gone to the point where we now can't go back. Meetings that we had to drive across town for, we can now have via video chat. Presentations like this, where you would have had to go to whatever library or location I was presenting at, can now be had in the comfort of your very own home, your car, while you're washing the dishes. And if you are washing the dishes right now or doing your laundry, absolutely okay. So the next question then is, are you comfortable on Zoom? Does this square make you anxious, or have you become okay with it? We actually do have one respondent that says, no, I had video calls already in the early 2000s. They worked in an IT company. Actually, I had video calls before the pandemic as well, but definitely not as often. I very occasionally had video calls with people. See, when it comes to people's comfort with Zoom, most people say yes, reluctantly, fairly comfortable, absolutely comfortable. So we really got a spectrum of people's comfort with Zoom, and I'm pleased to hear that, because it's something that's such a big part of our lives now. I see. So remember conference calls. I absolutely do remember conference calls. And I've got to say, doing it on Microsoft Teams or Zoom, much easier than conference calls to figure out whose voice is that? Everybody trying to talk over each other. No, thank you. So speaking of that, what's new with workplace communication? All of this. Slack, WebEx, Zoom, Teams, Microsoft, Google Hangouts, Google Meet, I don't remember which one it is now, and the various other tools and technologies somebody mentioned, the proliferation of a million tools for communication. Thankfully, the themes for the types of tools that we're using are more or less the same. What we have on this screen, Slack, Teams, they tend to do pretty much the same thing, or at least thematically do the same thing. WebEx, Zoom, Google Meet, they do video chat, webinars. They do pretty much the same thing. So even though the buttons are in different places, the nice thing is that once you learn how to use Zoom, you can switch to WebEx, because you know the kind of features that it's going to have. You just have to find where they are. And the methods of communication, we've had, for time immemorial, letters, memos. We had face-to-face meetings. We've had, face-to-face communication, meetings, face-to-face or video conferencing. Did I not put conference calls on there? We're talking about conference calls in the chat. I should have put conference calls on here, but I have phone calls on here. So most of these have been around even before the pandemic. Most of these aren't new at all. A few of these, though, have come more to the forefront over the last, I don't know how many years, into 5 years, even before the pandemic. Some of these were starting to come up. And I want to take a little deep dive into a reasonably shallow dive into chat, instant versus threaded. This is something that some people don't know, and it's a distinction that's somewhat important when it comes to what we're going to be talking about through the rest of the presentation. And so here is a representation of instant versus threaded chat. So instant chat is very much what it sounds like. It's not exactly synchronous because somebody could post a message and somebody else could not be there, but it's sort of like a text message where it's you and another person, you and multiple people, and it's like a chat room. Everybody's chatting at the same time. Everybody's messages are in the same kind of at the same level. And so you can see here one person. Let me see if I can do a laser pointer here. Yep, there you go. So one person talks to another person, and they've had this conversation here, and then they stop chatting for a while, and then this person messages again, and this person responds. So it's very much like that, and it all goes into one level here. Whereas threaded chat is a lot more like an online forum. And so you see here, somebody makes a post at the very top, and then two people respond to that post, somebody responds to somebody else's response, and somebody else makes another post, and somebody else responds. So there's distinct posts, distinct responses, and people can respond to each other's responses. Threaded chat tends to be a lot more asynchronous. Somebody will post a message, and then later somebody else will see it and respond to it. And though the conversations can get fairly long, these are two very different types of chat. And when we talked about timeliness earlier, and maybe timeliness is not the best word for this, but it's the word I'm using today. And I think we understand each other when I say timeliness. When instant chat, it's going to go away. Nobody feels like, even though realistically your company may hang on to it forever, but instant chat is not something. It's sort of disposable. You have your conversation and it's gone. Some companies even tend to delete chat messages. Their retention policy for instant chat is less than for like threaded chat. Whereas threaded chat sticks around for much longer. People are going to come back and refer to that. The conversations tend to take longer. So it's these things to consider when it comes to formality. And so here we are with levels of formality. And this is something that's very much a function of generations. Now, I created this sort of visual of levels of formality when it comes to communication. And the overarching point of this is that over time, what's new in workplace communication is that it's gone from being a lot more formal, let's say 50 years ago, 70 years, 100 years ago. Communication in the workplace was a lot more formal, to now where many organizations have moved to a lot more informality, for better or for worse. But I would say that if you take each of these communication modes and ask somebody of the generation that's after me and before me to decide how informal these things are, everybody may have a different perspective. And that's part of the challenge of workplace communication. We don't always agree on what is the level of formality when it comes to communication. That's pretty important in deciding how to communicate with somebody. But let me get a little bit into what I mean by formality, because it's not necessarily a term that's that straightforward to define. So what I mean by formality here, when it comes to this slide and when it comes to methods of communication, is 5 things. Number one is the level of hierarchy in an organization. How much hierarchy is there, and how important is hierarchy in an organization? There are some organizations that pride themselves on being more flat, where the CEO is right down there with the workers, and tech companies, sort of, at least startups, exemplify this, where everybody's kind of working in the same place. just no matter what people's, titles are, everybody's on the same level. Whereas in some organizations, you know, God forbid, if you try to talk to somebody two levels above you, you don't talk to those people. You definitely don't talk to your boss's boss. Very, very separate, follow chain of command. So that kind of, level of hierarchy or levels of hierarchy tends to speak to the formality of organization, the organizational culture. How do you speak to your boss? Somebody above you versus how you speak to your peers. Is it different? Are you more or less formal with your boss? Another way to think about formality is how much humor or whimsy is involved in your organization. Do people make jokes, or is everybody very serious? Sometimes that's context based. Sometimes in some meetings people are serious. Sometimes people have a sense of humor, but generally speaking, when it comes to organizations, I know that, for instance, like some county departments, very serious. Some county departments, a little bit more whimsical. When it comes to efficientness of language, you see this like in written communication. Somebody write, dear Mr. Andrews versus, hey, Bob. Different modes of communication require or tend to be more lenient towards a different level of formality in language. And that speaks to their overall level of formality. Another one is formatting expectations. There are some modes of communication where the format is very important and is very strict. When you're writing a business letter, the format is very strict. We learned in school exactly how to write a business letter. You write a date on the top right-hand side, or write a date, or it's justified. You write the person you're writing to, you write their address, all that kind of, so all the kind of stuff. The way that a cover letter looks, the format is pretty specific. Whereas when it comes to, like threaded chat, a forum, within Teams, Teams channels, for instance, the format is really not that important. Text messaging, whatever, it's not, you write how you write. There's usually not even paragraphs, it's just big blobs. And sometimes you can see generational differences when people tend to be of older generations will write a whole, paragraphs and line breaks and everything within a text message, whereas young people, well, just one big blob. Finally, we got timeliness. I mentioned this earlier. Letters, memos tend to stay pretty much put. They go into your file, the stuff you're going to refer to in the future. Threaded chat, emails lasts forever, usually, depending on the organization's retention policy. Email will be around, you're going to look it up later. Instant chat, it's going to be gone in 2 weeks. Text messages, they're going to be forgotten in 2 weeks. So the timeliness depends on the level of formality. Now, the question that we want to answer when it comes to thinking of level of formality is when, for instance, when do I call? When do I call? When do I send a text message, right? Sometimes it's not always clear what's the right thing to do at which time. So here are some ways to think about that. Before I move on, is everybody with me? Are we more or less clear on level of formality and why it's important, and why we're talking about it? Give me a yay or nay in the chat. If you need clarification, then I'm happy to provide some clarification before I move forward. It looks like we're moving forward. Thank you. Much appreciated. All right. So when do I call? Here's what we're thinking. I talked about level of formality. Is your company formal? And think about, what do you wear to work? Even even on video chat, like, do you have to wear, business clothes, or can you just wear a t-shirt? How can you contact your boss's boss? How do you talk to your boss? If it's more on the formal side, then you're probably going to be using these a lot more than you're going to be using these, especially when you're talking to somebody who's above you. what tools do you use? So I'm talking about, Zoom, WebEx, Slack, Basecamp. There's so many different tools that organizations use to communicate. And the question is your company using those tools? And I'm not talking about like whether they have them, because sometimes companies have tools and nobody uses them. So the question is, if your company is using Teams, then generally that's the way you're going to communicate with somebody. Now that within that, then there's a question of whether you send somebody an instant message, whether you post something in the Teams channel, whether you call them. There's these other questions, but generally you stick within that when it makes sense. And then, of course, is the communique urgent? Do you need to reach somebody right away? And this is also where generational differences come into play. Some of my younger staff members, some of my younger colleagues, I have to say, you should probably call that person if you really want to talk to them. If you need an answer now, don't send them an email. You should call them because you're gonna get a response right away if you call them. But younger people tend to be avoidant of phone calls because when you call somebody, you're kind of putting them on the spot. And we try to be nice and not put people on the spot. But if you need information right away, call them. Just like if you're in an office, you're gonna go to somebody's office. If you need to ask them something right away, you're not gonna send them an email or post something somewhere in your company message board. You're gonna go to their office and say, "Hey, Bob, do you have the numbers on this?" Of course, some of the way you decide is what's your relationship with that person. Even if it's somebody above you in an organization, if you're friendly with that person, if you guys have been working together for a long time, you know how they like to communicate. And it's much easier to then be on the more informal side of things if you are friendly with that person, because they're not going to mind if you send them a chat message without a letter of recommendation or something, or a letter of introduction. Whereas if it's somebody you've never talked to before, or somebody way above you in an organization, you might have to send an email and CC somebody else, have a whole paragraph of introduction of why you're messaging them in the first place. And then finally, have you asked how they like to communicate? This is something that many people eschew doing, but it's actually a pretty good thing to do, even if you've been working with somebody for a pretty long time. You know, Sometimes it's context dependent. So it's about a specific project or something. Do you want me to send you that by email? Do you want me to, just ping you via instant message? How do you want me to, or if you get a new boss or get a new employee, how do you like to communicate? Do you prefer if I, just call you? Do you prefer if I send you an instant message, an email? Everybody has their own preferences, present company included, us. All of us have our own preferences. And so sometimes it's good to ask or tell somebody how we prefer either a specific communication on a specific topic or a specific situation, or just in general. Let people know. So thus far, we've been talking about mostly one-to-one communication. Let's now switch over to talk about remote or hybrid meetings, something that has arisen over the last 5, 4, 3, I don't know how many years. We've shifted away from those dreaded conference calls to remote hybrid meetings, which for some people are also dreaded, although I like them. So here are the pros and cons to remote hybrid meetings. We know that the one great pro is now we don't have to drive all the way across town just for an hour-long meeting. I have to drive, I'm in Montrose, La Crescenta area. I had to drive to Manhattan Beach one of these a week or two ago. It took me 2 hours to get there for like a 30-minute program. If I could have done it as a remote or hybrid meeting, I could have saved 2 hours there and back. Now I'm talking about like 2 hours to drive there and then 2 hours to drive back. Insane. Great pro to hybrid meetings. I could also have meetings with people from all over the country, from all over the world, without leaving the comfort of my chair. It's a little bit easier for introverts to be involved in remote meetings because there are affordances for like raising your hand, or you don't have to interrupt the flow of conversation. You can make yourself seen without being kind of intrusive or having the feeling of being intrusive. Not everybody's great at interrupting the flow of conversation. So remote meetings tend to be easier for introverts. The collaborative possibilities, now I have this on both pros and cons. So the con of hybrid meetings is a smaller collaborative workspace. We're talking about screens here, so for some people it's cell phones. Whereas when we're all in a room together, we can have whiteboards, we can have, flip charts, we can have all pieces of paper, a giant piece of paper we're all writing on all together. So we have different options. When in a room together, we could also use the digital tools. Whereas when we're all remote, we're sort of stuck to using the tools that we have. And sometimes they're good, and sometimes they're not as good. They're not as useful for what we're doing. And so that's, in some ways, it's both a pro and a con. When it comes to remote hybrid meetings, people's attention can also be sort of, it's easier for an attention to float away if there aren't people right in front of you. If your camera's off and your microphone is off and you're just, you can kind of. I take notes at meetings often, even meetings where I don't have to take notes, because when I'm taking notes, I know I'm going to be paying attention. So, these pros and cons, there's good things and bad things for remote or hybrid meetings. For a situation like this, we're coming to a webinar. It's being recorded, so it's easy to record. All I have to do is press a button. Whereas in-person meetings, a little bit difficult to record. We can, of course, push a button on a tape recorder, but who's going to listen to that tape again? We can have a video camera, but who's going to watch that video? Here, the online environment and organizations, companies like Zoom, who make the software for video conferencing, to make it very easy to record and rewatch the video. Something that people have to get used to when it comes to hybrid meetings and video chat in general with multiple people is that now all of a sudden multi-channel communication is the normal way of doing things. So we're having this presentation, I'm talking to you, and at the same time I'm also looking at the chat. You can kind of see where my eyes go. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm seeing the chat here. I'm peeking into the chat even if I'm not responding to all the questions in chat. I have, one eye is looking at the chat, one eye is looking at, my image as I'm speaking, one eye is looking at my notes, one eye is looking at my, the presentation. I have only two eyes, and yet they're all over the place. I'm so used to doing these presentations and being in this environment that for me, this multi-channel communication is almost second nature. But when somebody's just starting in remote work, doing remote hybrid meetings, they've got the chat going. You've got somebody speaking during the meeting. You've got another side conversation going on in the chat. You've got to pay attention to the person's voice. You've got to pay attention to the video. It's just sensory overload. The good thing is that for the majority of people, becoming comfortable with multi-channel communication is a lot like learning to drive. At first, when you learn to drive, there is just too much to pay attention to. You've got a driving instructor next to you, and they're giving you instructions, one thing after another. You're making a left turn, and you're just like, this car is coming, and I have to move a little bit forward and press the gas. Oh, wait, but, back up on the gas. I don't know. But now you drive, and you don't even think about it. You're making a left turn, and it's just second nature. You could be listening to an audiobook and maybe juggling oranges and driving and putting on makeup and making a left turn. I don't recommend doing any of those things, but you can. Same thing with multi-channel communication. Some ways that we shift from traditional to digital body language. If, for instance, like I'm saying, some people are more introverted, so you often have your camera off, not as responsive. My face is very responsive. People talk to me. I make faces. I smile. I do all sorts of things. You can see how I'm feeling by my face, by just this part. Besides my waving my hands around. But online, you also have things like you could like somebody's comment in the chat. You could post a little, in Teams, you can post a little confetti when somebody says something that you like, and it'll just, just appear for a second, so somebody gets feedback from you right away. There's all sorts of random emojis that are out there that, while not replacing people's real emotions and the depths of people's emotions, give somebody a little bit of instant recognition of how what they're saying is coming across. And of course, you've got detailed feedback. You can post things in the chat. You can also talk. So there's a variety of ways that while the digital environment takes some things away, it also adds some things. So here's some tips and considerations for hybrid meetings before we move on to working in the cloud. Somebody mentioned in the chat lighting, and that's absolutely true. So we're talking about be clear about camera preferences, and that's something that I typically, it's typically something for supervisors, but not always. I mean, everybody has to be clear about camera preferences within an organization. In some meetings, everybody has their camera on. There's maybe 20 people in the meeting and everybody has their camera on. So most people, you just see people going. But with some meetings, in some organizations, I think this is how it makes sense more. I mean, in my personal opinion, if there's a few people in a meeting, like 5 people in a meeting, everybody can have their camera on, because chances are that, first of all, we can pay attention to 5 people's facial expressions at once. Second of all, there's rarely going to be a time where each person isn't going to say something. And so you want to be able to have your camera on, so when somebody has something to say, when people agree with you, that sort of thing. That said, when I have a meeting with like my staff, I don't always ask them to put the camera on. I don't really care. I have my camera on often if I'm the one speaking. But generally, I'm okay with, since I know them, also we've been working together for a long time, I'm okay with just hearing their voices. But you want to be clear about what your company culture is when it comes to putting on your camera. And if you're the supervisor, you want to let people know what your preference is about putting on camera, keeping mics muted, etc. You want to be prepared with the technology, even though Teams, WebEx, Zoom tend to be similar when it comes to their features. You want to test how your lighting levels are, whether your mic is working properly. You can always adjust settings. I always have a background on because I work in different places and I don't need people to be distracted by what's in my background. So I tend to have similar backgrounds on I tend to have virtual backgrounds on. And so you want to test your virtual background. Some work better than others. So it's a question in many organizations: do you arrive early or do you arrive right on time? So at a physical meeting, you tend to arrive a few minutes early so you can get seated, so you can get your stuff out. On a virtual meeting, you doing all that stuff doesn't affect anybody else. And so if you want to get there right on time, you log in at the, at the time of the meeting sharp and you're ready to go. Great. In some organizations, people tend to get to the meetings a little bit early just so they can chat. I was talking about informal communication, casual conversations earlier, and the importance of that. In some places, people get to the meetings early and just, chit chat, kind of have an icebreaker, ask about weekends before. And I think that's a good practice generally. Do you have your visual aids ready? I was going to say there's nothing worse, but there's a lot of things that are worse than having to wait a few seconds while somebody's bumbling with their visual aids, both in the physical environment and also in the virtual environment. The nice thing about the virtual environment is that you can have all those things all ready to go, that you don't have to, if you're going after somebody else, you still have those things on your computer. Whereas if you're going after somebody else in a physical meeting, they have to remove their stuff, you have to put your stuff, it takes time. But because in a remote environment, you can have your stuff ready in advance. I recommend doing that. And any notes that you need to take, anything that you're gonna have to present, have that up in advance. Don't be searching for that right, during the meeting. The nice thing about remote or hybrid tools is that you tend to have the option to post an agenda somewhere where all the meeting recipients or meeting participants are going to be able to see it. So you want to take advantage of that. get the agenda up, post the agenda in advance so people can prepare for the meeting. Sometimes you can even make that a collaborative document, and then people can add their own parts of the agenda or put notes or links to things that are important for everybody to look at when it comes to the agenda. And it behooves you to post it well in advance in that situation so everybody has a chance to look at what they need to look at to be productive in the meeting. Finally, use chat to record action items in real time. So when somebody says, okay, we all need to do this, or even in the beginning, we need to decide this, you post a question in the chat, everybody can see that. Everybody can sort of gather around that question. And then later, when the meeting is over, 2 days later, when it was like, what did we talk about? You can go look in that meeting chat and you can see, oh, we decided that so-and-so was going to do this, so-and-so was going to do that. It makes it a lot easier for everybody to have kind of a shared knowledge of what happened at that meeting. Speaking of sharing, the next section is all about sharing. That's working in the cloud. When I said earlier that a lot of these workplace trends aren't exactly new, the cloud is exactly what I was talking about. People have been talking, the cloud was a huge thing 20 years ago. Everybody's moving towards the cloud. I was in library school. I was writing papers about, web-based word processing, and where you save things in like Google Drive. It wasn't called Google Drive then. But really, the cloud has been around for a pretty long time. For those not familiar with the cloud, it's not that complicated of a concept. It's actually relatively simple. Oh, I have a misspelling in my slide. Where are the files stories? I guess I can go with that. What are the files stories? Where do they start? Where do they end up? That's the question when it comes to the cloud. It's really, all about where files are stored. Traditionally, we're used to having our files stored on our computer, on our hard drive within the big box. When it comes to the cloud, the main difference is that the files are now stored in servers somewhere else. But that is not that different from what we're used to, at least those of us who use web-based email. I've been using Gmail for 20 years, something like that, maybe a little more than 20 years. And since I use web-based Gmail, all my files in my email have been stored on Google servers this whole time. So my email has been in the cloud. So people who use cell phones, if you use an iPhone, your email is downloaded from the servers onto your phone so you can read it. So it's both in the cloud and locally stored. The other question with the cloud is, how are the files accessed? Different people have different access permissions, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But files can be accessed from the cloud through your phone, through your computer, through specific pieces of software. So in my generation, they kept files in file cabinets, even as far as 2 years ago. Realistically, some companies keep files in file cabinets even now because, well, all companies do, because there's certain reporting requirements, there's certain document auditing requirements that require you to have files, backups of files and files kept away. So I think most, especially big companies, still have files in file cabinets, and that's a normal thing. There's certain affordances that paper has that the digital environment doesn't have. We should know that, and absolutely true. But basically, the cloud is just files stored somewhere else, somewhere all in one place. The nice thing about working in the cloud is that it really facilitates remote work. So it's hastened adoption of working. The pandemic has really hastened the adoption of working in the cloud, whereas we don't have as many files saved locally now. We have more files saved in the cloud. For large organizations, this is as much a security consideration as it is just an everyday work consideration. So here's a little story about the documents workflow when it comes to working in the cloud, to give you an example and things to think about when it comes to cloud-based work. So I'm going to read you this story. Nadia and Daryl are assigned to create a slideshow for their boss, Sam. I have the slideshow. It's a slideshow about toy bears. It's a slideshow about teddy bears. This is the presentation. Daryl creates the presentation on his computer and saves a copy to the cloud. And then he gives Nadia edit access, so she can then edit the document. Nadia later goes in, makes edits to the document. The next day, Nadia and Daryl have a phone meeting where they go in and simultaneously, from both of their computers, which are in different places, polish the presentation. So she might be working on one slide, he might be working on another slide at the same time, while they're talking about what needs to be done to the presentation. Once they're happy with that, they end their phone call. They share the presentation with their boss, Sam, who goes in and leaves comments. So he doesn't make edits to the actual contents of the presentation. He just leaves comments within, Microsoft PowerPoint allows you to leave comments. Google Slides allows you to leave comments. And that's a different edit. That's a different level of permission or access. Some people can edit a document, so they can make any changes. Some people can only leave comments, and some people can just view the document and make no changes to it. So in this situation, they gave comment access to Sam, and he went in and he made comments. He doesn't want to get his hands dirty with all the details of it. He just wants to leave overall comments. Then Nadia goes in, makes the edits that Sam requested, and pushes a little check mark that says she's addressed those comments, or she puts responses if she has questions about his comments. Then Sam gets an email saying that the comments have been resolved, so that all these things that he wanted changed have been changed. And he gets a verification of that. He can also go in and look at the presentation to make sure. On the day of the presentation, Sam downloads the presentation. He takes the file from the cloud. He downloads it, which he brings the file puts it on a flash drive. He goes, outside of his work site, to whatever organization he's presenting at. He puts in that flash drive. That file comes up, not cloud-based anymore. Now it's just on the flash drive. Gives a presentation. The slide shows success. Their vendor orders 100,000 teddy bears, and the presentation is a success. What are the questions here when it comes to our document workflow? So quiz question. How many copies of the presentation are there in this story? Is it 5? Is it 1? Is it 2? Person says none. One person says 1. One person says 2. 1. Now, you're wise to say 1, although the answer really is 3. Notice that Daryl creates a presentation on his computer and saves a copy to the cloud. So he has the presentation saved locally. He also saves a copy to a different folder in the cloud. The file that him and Nadia are editing is the copy in the cloud. Then, at the end, Sam downloads the presentation onto the flash drive. That's the third version of that file. So now, if either Nadia or Daryl realize they made a mistake and they change the cloud-based copy, neither Daryl's copy nor Sam's flash drive copy are going to get those changes. So it can be a little complex, and it's something that even though I'm using cloud-based stuff all the time, it's something that I have to think about. Wait, am I editing the right file? I want to make sure that I edit the right file so that if I'm collaborating with people, that my edits will be visible to everybody and not just me. Another question that occurs here, and this question you don't have to answer in the chat if you don't want to, who has edit access to this document? And I mentioned this earlier. Permissions is pretty important when it comes to working in the cloud for both security reasons, but also for just collaborative purposes. Who needs to have edit access, full edit access? Who needs to just have commenting privileges? Who needs to be able to just view it? So for instance, if you're sending a presentation to somebody outside of your organization to just as a reference, then you would give them viewing access, viewing privileges. You also might just save a copy as a PDF, like I'm going to do with these slides for you later. Save it as a PDF, send it to them. Or you can just give them a link that gives them only viewing access. And so they're going to be accessing the cloud-based copy, but they're not going to be able to do anything to it other than look at it. Then we've got the question of how does each person interact with the document, right? Each person in this story interacts with the document a little bit differently. Nadia and Daryl, for the most part, are the same. Daryl is a creator of the file. Nadia and Daryl are editing the file. Sam comments on the file, and then Sam uses the file to put up a slideshow, does the presentation. Depending on how each person interacts with a document, whether it's a slideshow or whatever kind of document, spreadsheet in an organization, depends on whether they want the file to be cloud-based or they want the file to be locally available on their computer. And then finally, what are the affordances? This is a bigger question that I'm going to answer right now. This could be a whole presentation on itself. What are the affordances of a cloud-based workplace? When I say affordances, I've used this term before. I mean, what can you do? What are the features? What are the capabilities of a cloud-based workspace? And I'm not just talking about the document itself. I'm talking about the whole apparatus of the file system, the directory structure, all of that within the cloud-based environment. And there are many affordances in a cloud-based environment that make remote work a lot easier. Okay, I'm going to breathe for a second before I move on to the future of work. I'm talking about what's new in workplace communication. I feel like some of these things in the future of work are going to be added to this presentation if I deliver it in the next year, next 2 years, next 3 years. However, I'm not sure I want animated workspaces to be the normal way that we interact at work. However, it's always amusing to see them. And I feel like the more virtual reality or VR or XR even, which is virtual reality plus augmented reality, etc., different kind of media mediated realities develop. Everybody's talking about VR like 3 or 4 years ago, and now nobody's talking about VR at all. But VR is still being developed, and there's a potential in the future that we will be working wearing VR masks, and our avatars will be in an office. So we're remotely and in a virtual office, kind of almost embodied in a virtual office simultaneously, which may or may not change various culture things about organizations. So animated workspaces may have a future. We'll see. I doubt that they're going to look like this, though. Well, you see the formality of this company. This guy's wearing a cowboy hat. This guy's wearing a baseball cap. It is clearly an internet startup here. Then the prevalence of hybrid or 100% remote workers. It's right now we're seeing a lot of articles in the press about companies calling people back, about some companies not calling people back and going 100% remote. I feel like we're at a bit of a stalemate now, where companies that went hybrid or fully remote during the pandemic are sort of going the other way a little bit, but not completely. And some companies are just embracing remote and changing. Companies that are starting now are using the workforce around the world, or at least within their whole time zone. So there's going to be potentially, when it comes to looking for jobs, remote is already a very strong area where one can look for jobs. Before you filtered remote work, it was a side thing. Not that many companies did it. Now it's around. It's very common. New tools to overcome hybrid challenges. So like scheduling meetings online, I was talking about the construction sounds. There are built-in tools to like Zoom, etc., that will filter out all those background noises. New tools that will help us, like, and I was talking about AI, I have AI assistants here, and this is related. There are already AI assistants out there that will take notes for you during meetings, that will pull out the action items for you based on the context of your conversation and their processing. And for somebody who takes notes during meetings sometimes and uses that and likes that, I feel like I'm also happy that there's going to be AI taking notes, because it's probably going to be better than my notes. But AI assistants are going to help us a lot in the future of work. They're helping us. I mean, I think they're helping me already. But they are going to be helping us in workplace communication as well. And with that, I will now pause for Q&A. So if you have questions, throw them into the Q&A. I'm going to go back in the chat to see if I can read questions up in the chat. But if you have questions in the chat and you want to repost them in the Q&A, I would appreciate that, just so I can look at one place instead of going back and forth between the chat and the Q&A. All right, let's see now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go up in the chat to see if I had any questions up above. Okay, I see a question here. Remote work has some real benefits that I appreciate, but the relative isolation from other human beings has created an epidemic of loneliness in the country, according to the Surgeon General. Any new data on the mental health of remote workers? That's an excellent question. It's a very cogent observation. I have not seen any data. I have not looked for any data, but if you email me, I would be interested in doing a little bit more research on that for you. I would say that the pandemic of, the epidemic of loneliness and social isolation goes beyond work. I think that's just something that's been happening in our society over decades. It's been moving in the wrong direction. My personal opinion about this, it doesn't speak to the larger trends. I mostly work remotely, and I'm on meetings all day. So I feel like I'm communicating with people all day long. So because we use Teams, I'm on Zoom all the time. I'm video chatting with people. I don't really feel isolated very much at all. But I can imagine that somebody who isn't interacting with people as much, somebody who's doing different kind of work than I am, can feel the sort of the oppressive quietude of being in solitude all day long. So I think this is something that companies are going to have to consider, because if somebody's not doing well mentally, they're not going to be doing well with their work. And so they're going to have to consider how to increase morale, how to create network opportunities for people who may not see people at the water cooler anymore. It's definitely an important question, important concern. Somebody said, we talked about this. Remember conference calls? Yes, I do. All right, let me see here. What do you understand under visual aids? So visual aids can be anything. When we're talking about workplace communication, and particularly remote workplace communication, visual aids can be anything from GIFs that you post in instant messages about your response to something, or emojis, or just the traditional visual aids like graphs, charts that you post during a meeting. And those are now even easier to post and relatively easy to create. So if you need to visualize some statistics, Microsoft Excel, Google Sheets can do that for you pretty quickly. Let's see here. Something like AI workplace. I'm still trying to get over being creeped out by memojis. Yeah, AI workplaces can be. We'll see what happens. All right, let me see some of these questions. So many methods of communication, overwhelming to coordinate or keep track of. Truly. The good thing is, like I said before, though, that for the most part, the things haven't changed a whole lot. It's mostly just different types of chat, remote chat, and the prevalence of video chat and video conferences that have, those are the real big changes. There's so much group text all those notifications, ding, 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 it makes me anxious. Got to turn off the notifications. That's something that's here's a tip for staying sane when you're a member of a lot of different chats. Mute the notifications. There are some chats that I'm on Microsoft Teams all day. There are some chats, like there's some group chats for different units and different departments that I'm part of, where most of the messages aren't relevant to me, individually. So if somebody's going on a break or something, that's not relevant. I don't need to get a notification that somebody's going on a break. So I muted those and I check in on those regularly, throughout the day, but I check on them when I want to check in on them. And if somebody needs me individually, they can message me individually, or they could at me, they can ping me, and then I'll get a notification. But be judicious about when you turn off notifications, when it comes to on the phone, turn off the buzzing, turn off the ping on the phone, and do that with the tools. And all the tools, Slack, Teams, Basecamp, they let you turn off notifications in many places and in many different ways. So use that option. So we talked about people mentioned etiquette in the chat, and etiquette is a function of formality, using punctuation, exclamation points, periods, like ellipses, things that are a lot more common in text messages, but a lot less common in written communication, like letters, written letters, formatted letters. The challenge is in the middle part of that is email. When can you be more informal in email? When can you put 3 exclamation points or 10 exclamation points? And that really depends on, harken back to your relationship with the person that you're writing with. There's some people that we communicate with who we're friendly with, colleagues, usually the people at the same level, where we can put, 10 exclamation points and a smiley face, and the other person will just laugh and understand. Whereas, I'm not going to send a message, to like somebody 5 levels above me with the same kind of informal kind of communication. So that's something that's, when it comes to the formality, younger people, older people, everybody in between has to be aware of what the culture is in the organization. And for particularly younger people, this is a kind of a learning curve, whereas you may not have been in an environment where you have to be more formal. So now it's time to think, okay, how is everybody else doing it? Maybe I should consider how I'm doing it as well. And sometimes it's a learning experience. Sometimes you get reprimanded because of your writing style. That's okay. It's a learning experience. Let me see about going into getting posts in the chat here. Getting posts in the queue. I'm going to go through the Q&A and then I'll go back to the chat. Text messages, line breaks versus block breaks. I try to put all the same block, so don't ding the person a zillion times. But since most people send a lot of consecutive little blocks, is that the better way to do it? If you need to send a message that requires, paragraph breaks, that might be better sent in a different medium. Like if you have to send something that's really long, that might actually just be better as an email. There are some people who, when you're chatting, feel like, text message has more of a conversational feel. So sometimes when you're talking, you talk to somebody, oh, I have another thought, and then you start sending messages like you're just kind of scrolling in somebody's little text message field. But that's a situation where that it's a paragraph and there's another paragraph, like you see the person typing and they're typing something really long. That's where an email is probably better. Or even an instant message, bring that on the computer. There, you don't type on your phone, you can type on your keyboard. You can also turn off notifications for somebody temporarily, and then while you're in a conversation with them, turn off the notification, and then you're not going to get those bings while you already have the phone with you, or just put your phone on silent when it's already there, because you don't need it to be vibrating when you're holding it. You don't need to be binging when you're holding it. So feel free to just turn that off. Currently, I'm a big fan of turning on a notification. I hate when my phone buzzes and bings. It's very distracting for me. So yeah, I turn off all the app notifications, all that kind of stuff as much as I can. Great subject would be the use of lighting, especially. Find ring lights. I find ring lights that blind me, but I can't figure out what I'm doing wrong. The angle of it might be the thing. So ring lights create a lot of ambient light. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like right in front of you, like right in front of your eyes, because ring lights can be really bright. And when they're right in front of your eyes, obviously you can't see. So you can put it like, somewhere kind of at an angle or somewhere else because they're going to create an ambient glow. So that's okay to do, or just make it dimmer. A lot of ring lights allow you to dim them, and so take advantage of that. You don't like, I'm really bright right now because I have a light right there, and this is just a function of my workspace. But the light is not right. The light is up above, so it's not right in front of me. If this light was like right here, I would be squinting the whole time. So yeah, ring lights are nice, but the best light is just natural light. So if you can sit, you can put your computer in front of a window and have an open window, it's going like where light's going like that's probably ideal. Of course, it depends on what you're doing. If you're filming video, it's one thing. If you're doing a presentation, it's another thing. If you're just chatting with your coworkers, that's another thing. The requirements and the expectations for those things are a little bit different. We got a question: how does security work in the cloud? That's a great question. And it's similar to the way security works, with most web services. I'm not going to get super deep into it, but basically people from the outside, even if you have an organizational cloud, like if you're using OneDrive or Google Drive, people from the outside, you don't want them getting in and accessing all the files. So there's virtual private networks. So only people with VPN access, that's one level of protection, can access that drive. You have to have a username and password to access the drive. Individual file permissions. You don't give permissions to people. It's not easy to give permissions to people outside of your organization. So that's something that we have to be careful about, within an organization, that we don't give file permissions to somebody outside who we don't want to see the files. But those are the kind of the basics. But it's really just layers of protection, both from the IT side and then from the individual employee side. We all have to be wary and cognizant of potential threats. What kind of light do you use? I use a ceiling light. It's just a light, in my kind of office space. I just have a light in the ceiling. My light is really, I would actually turn that light off and turn another light on, but I don't have a fancy ring light setup right now. When I make videos for YouTube, just specifically for YouTube, not just recorded webinars, then I'll take a ring light and I have a few other lights that will create a sort of nice ambient glow and give me a very even light. Whereas right now, as you can see, like it's just like right there. It's a very bright light right here. But I would create a more ambient glow, and that's, there's various options for that. But the evenness is the important thing, so you don't have shadows and things like that. If you're creating the YouTube content. So that's everything that was in the Q&A. Let me take a quick peek into the chat to see what I've missed here. Oh, somebody said, I recently joined a conference where they also had animated locations like a lobby, coffee room, coffee bar. It's kind of fun. I've seen those. I feel like they're kind of corny, but it could be fun because you're chatting with it's ways of interaction. I mean, you're chatting with people in there. So if they help people interact more at the conference, then they're a win. What about generation differences that some people would rather talk on the phone rather than use these modern means? So a very sort of general idea is that the previous generations, the older generations, tend to be more on the formal side of the scale, whereas the younger generations tend to be a lot more keen on text messaging. But it's not necessarily the formality. It's that younger people, I don't know, I'm sort of in the middle of it, so I don't really, there's certain things that I prefer people just email me about. Like if somebody's going to give me a lot of information, email is better because then I'll be able to review it. And if I have to make decisions on it, doing it on the phone, I'm not going to be deciding on the phone. So I'd rather get an email. If somebody needs something from me right away, then you need to call me, or you can text me. Uh, text, I grew up at a time where text didn't exist, so I was only like a teenager, a late teenager when text sort of became very common. And at that point, I kind of rejected and didn't reject because the phones weren't very comfortable to text on. Now it's just kind of especially for workplaces that aren't super formal, text messaging is a very normal way to communicate with people, and for better or for worse. But those are the kind of generational differences. I mean, I guess people are comfortable with the modes of communication that they grew up with, and some people have adapted and changed, and some people have more trouble doing that. So I think that's some ways to consider that. But it's a whole topic, generation. We're actually going to have a program on intergenerational differences in the workplace in January. So, be on the lookout for that. That's going to be a very interesting one. So, I had a comment here. Mobile phones already isolated people a lot, but I think it's all about how people handle the tools available. I never felt isolated in a virtual environment, but I do feel weird if people sitting in front of me looking at their phone all the time. It's a cogent comment related to the question that we had before about social isolation in a remote environment. Indeed, I think it's a matter of how you use your tools, but also the kind of job you have. Some jobs don't put you in touch with people as often as compared to something like my job where I'm in touch with people all day long. So it really depends. I had the feeling they interacted more than they were listening to the presenter. Oh, I see. So sometimes when you're at like a webinar or something, people are talking to each other in addition to kind of paying attention to the presenter. So it's like people are having sidebar conversations via text or via their own instant messaging. And that can be distracting if you're trying to pay attention to everybody's like, to a certain extent, you want people to be, to demonstrate that they're paying attention to the main event rather than just, making the main event their own personal conversations. All right. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A right now. We're getting to the end of our presentation. And so since we're already here, I'm going to post a link to the post-event survey in the chat. I always request that you fill out the post-event survey. It's very short, but it definitely helps us come up with future programs. And I always appreciate the feedback that you give us, whether the program is good or bad, or what we can improve on, what we're doing well. Take a minute or two to fill out that survey. And since I don't see any other questions right now, I thank you for being here. I appreciate you sticking with me during this presentation. I appreciate you learning and teaching me via your comments in the chat and your questions. And with that, see you next week.